2, 1. We are recording.
Well, I want to welcome everyone to our meeting here for the Free Inquiry Group. Today, we do have a few announcements before we get started. So we do have an event coming up November 10th, just kind of a social chat via Zoom. November 16th, we have our projects committee, which is led by Bill Messer there. We'll be meeting. People are welcome to attend that if they're interested in joining the committee. Other than that, things are going well. I'll turn it over to Elaine to introduce our speaker.
Hello, everybody. I get to introduce Desirée Willis today, and I wanted to do this because every time I hear her speak, I am just amazed at the amount of knowledge that she has on women gaining the right to vote. She spoke last year for a FIG group, and it was fascinating. And then she had more information on a trivia game we had for another group, and now she's going to do another group. But the more I learn about Desirée Willis, the more information is just amazing. Her love of women's history began in elementary school, thanks to Reading is Fundamental. It's a program that allows students to choose 2 free books a school year, and the first book she chose was The Secret Soldier. It's a book about the life of Deborah Sampson, who fought in the Revolutionary War. I don't know if people know that. I think she dressed as a man in order to do that. The second book was a bio on Susan B. Anthony, and thus her love of women's history began. By age 12, she was calling herself a feminist and had renounced her fundamentalist Christian faith. During her junior years, she won an award from National Organization for Women for her portrayal of Susan B. Anthony in the Ohio History Day competition. Part of her research for the presentation included meeting and talking with local women who voted in 1920. Those women inspired her for women's rights and always vote. Desirée believes strongly in education and is passionate about social justice. She's also an avid walker who has organized over 300 urban walks throughout Cincinnati, where she has shared history of the neighborhood with her fellow walkers as they strolled. A few years ago, she decided to combine her love of history, walking, and women's rights to create an urban walk featuring stories of suffrage in the Queen City. Since then, she has led our walk numerous times and is currently offering it by appointment to groups via Harriet Beecher Stowe House, where she volunteers. She is also on the board of the directors for the Community of Reason and is head of the newly formed Education Committee, where she intends to continue promoting the history of women and female power. Last year, she gave a lecture, like I said before, version of her urban walk. Big, and it was well received. I really enjoyed it. This year, she will discuss more in-depth the history of the national movement, including events in Cincinnati, and how American women changed the hearts and minds of those in power to win the right to vote. So, further ado, I present Desirée Willis. Thank you. And if you have questions, just put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, and then we can ask them later.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, is everybody seeing screen?
Yeah.
I know.
Yes.
Okay. I have to go to slideshow here. Okay, American Rebels, how American women got the vote. I am going to start. I'm going to give you a 2.5-minute timeline of the history of suffrage, and then we'll talk more. Starting with the turn of the 19th century in the early 1800s, education for women begins. In 1803, the Bradford Academy opened its doors to women. They were the first school to do so. After that, several academies and seminaries began opening across the country for girls and women, including the Hartford Seminary, which was opened by our own Catherine Beecher. Women joined the abolition movement and temperance movements, where they gained leadership skills and then start to advocate for their own rights. In 1840, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton meet and become besties. In 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention is held at Seneca Falls. In 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell, a Cincinnati suffragist, becomes the first woman doctor in the United States. In 1850, the first official National Rights Convention is held in Salem, Ohio. It will be held every year up until 1861, when the Civil War begins. In 1866, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the American Equal Rights Association to advocate for universal suffrage. In 1868, the suffrage movement splits over the 15th Amendment. They split into two organizations, Anthony and Stanton's National Women's Suffrage Association and the Stone Brown American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1870, the 15th Amendment giving Black men the right to vote is ratified. By 1876, the Women's Christian Temperance Union is founded by Frances Willard in Hillsboro, Ohio. Temperance adopts a platform of supporting suffrage. In 1890, the NWSA and the AWSA, which were the two women's movements that split, reunite as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1896, the National Association of Colored Women is created. In 1913, we have the Women's Suffrage March on Washington, led by NASWA. That's the National Association of American Women's Suffrage. In 1916, the National Women's Party is created by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. In 1916, Jeanette Rankin of Montana becomes the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. In 1917, the Great War, also known as World War I, begins. From 1917 to 1919, the National Women's Party will annoy Woodrow Wilson, leading to their arrest, abuse, and making national headlines in the mainstream press, essentially turning the tide in their favor. By 1919, the Women's Suffrage Amendment of 1878, written by Susan B. Anthony, will be reintroduced into Congress. Woodrow Wilson will encourage Congress to pass it. In 1920, Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment on August 18th, 1920. So let's begin our journey a little more in depth. We're going to start with the first series of rebels. These were the Rebels of Reason, and they ran the movement from 1800 to 1860, we'll say. The first Rebels of Reason were the ones who wanted education. Again, I mentioned the Bradford Academy in 1803 opens its doors to women. In 1823, Catherine Beecher opens the Hartford Female Seminary. I call her the original STEM girl because she is one of the first schools to teach girls science and math. She herself did not have a formal education in science. She would practice science experiments on the Beecher kitchen table during the weekends and then teach it to her students during the week. In 1829, the first public geometry exam is held for American girls. And in 1833, Oberlin College will be the first college to open their doors to women. The next group of women will insist now on the right to own property and have equal opportunities. When I tell you about two such women, on the left we have Frances Fanny Wright, and on the right we have Ernestine Rhodes. Both of these women are not only suffragists, feminists, and women's rights advocates, they are also atheists. Frances Fanny Wright was called the Red Harlot of Liberty by the press because she was so compassionate in her struggle for women's rights, and she also blamed the oppression of women on religion openly. In 1828, she was the first woman in Cincinnati to advocate for property rights for women, and she did so on the Hamilton County Courthouse steps. So that was the first time Cincinnati had ever seen anything like that. Her protege was Ernestine Rose, a little younger than her. She got a little better treatment because she was known as a very great orator. However, she liked to get on the nerves also of the clergymen. And in Maine, in 1855, one Maine minister said of her, "We know of no object more deserving of contempt and loathing than a female atheist. We hold the vilest strumpet from the stews to be by comparison respectable." So that's how much she was loved for her atheism. But these two women will campaign for property rights for women, along with other notables such as Lucy Stone. So they got their education, they're fighting for property rights, they're fighting for business rights. Now they start to want suffrage. The real journey begins. In 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had just married her husband, Henry Stanton. Henry Stanton was one of the Lane Rebels, for those of you familiar with Cincinnati history. He was a student at the Lane Seminary, which was Lyman Beecher of the Beecher family was the president of the school. And while he was away from town, some of his students decided to hold a debate on the morality of slavery. And they came out with it saying that basically slavery was immoral, and it caused a national scandal, and it almost closed the door of schools. And it did end up in the students having to leave the school because basically the Reverend Beecher couldn't get them under his control, because once they decided abolition was the only moral answer, they refused to comply with the school's rules on abolition. But as such, he ends up marrying Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they go to London for a abolition convention during their honeymoon. And there she meets a woman named Lucretia Mott, who she will become best friends with. Lucretia and Elizabeth, they are refused admission to the convention. They're told they can go sit upstairs in the gallery with the other women and be quiet. They can listen quietly. Well, they're not very happy about this. In fact, they're quite incensed. And this is actually the basis of their lifelong friendship. And they will bond over this moment and start be the founders of the modern day women's movement in America. Inspired by women of the Iroquois Nation who have rights to practice government they participate in their government, they decide to advocate for the right of American women to vote. And they send out invitations and put some ads in a local paper for a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls. They don't think anybody will come. And conveniently enough, on the day of the convention, the church that they're holding their meeting at is locked. Bear in mind, this church, which is pictured here, is never locked, but on that day it was. So Elizabeth sends her nephew in the window, and he opens the door, and then they continue to sit, wondering if anyone will show up. Lo and behold, the wagons start coming, and 300 people squeeze into that church for the first convention. Lucretia Mott will get her revenge, because as the meeting opens, she welcomes everyone. The first thing she does is assures all the women in attendance not to be concerned about their level of education or their social status. This meeting is for them, and everyone here is equal. To the men, she says to keep your mouths shut. She tells the men, you may sit silently and observe the first day. she did allow them to speak on the 2nd. During the convention, they draft what is known as the Declaration of Sentiments, where they will declare that all men and women are created equal. If you don't recognize this, this is obviously written based on the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, when the founders wrote that, you'll know that the next thing they do is name their aggressor, and they name King George. These women point to the men, and they name men as their oppressors. They then write up a list of grievances against men and all the horrible things that they've done to women, after which they then draft up a series of resolutions on how they will gain their independence and take back their power. Number 9 on that list is a call for suffrage for women. This was extremely controversial, even at this meeting. So controversial, in fact, that Henry Stanton of the Lane Rebels, guy who took on Lyman Beecher, conveniently had an appointment and couldn't make it to the convention that day because he did not want to be anywhere near that place when that particular issue came up. He thought his dear Lizzie had taken things a little too far. Much to her amazement, a man, Frederick Douglass, that you probably have all heard of, stood up and announced his support of the resolution, and one by one, the entire room would go on to approve suffrage as one of the things that they will work for going forward. So he was the perfect ally that day, shall we say. They decide after the convention that they'll meet yearly from then on. And their first convention is in 1850. For some reason, they skip 1849. They start in 1850 in Salem, Ohio. Again, they'll hold these conventions yearly up until the Civil War. So that is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And we have some other notables, rebels of reason. Lucy Stone, A Cincinnati Love Story. So Lucy Stone was known because of that short haircut she's got. That's not pinned up. That is her hair length. In 1850, she had short hair, and she was also famous for wearing bloomers. She made them popular. Lucy Stone was a very young suffragist in 1848. In fact, she was kind of like, well, she was a rock star. She would travel the country giving speeches about women's rights, and the young teens and young women in America would follow her just like she was a rock star on tour. They would know where she was going, what she was talking about, and they actually called themselves the Lucy Stoners, which I love. But in 1850, she gets tied forever to Cincinnati, because while she's in Cincinnati promoting women's rights, she needs to cash a check. There's a hardware store in town, the Ryland Coombs and Blackwell hardware store, and the Blackwells, Samuel and Henry, who are two of the owners, are well known in the suffrage community as being allies to the movement. They give a lot of support and money to the suffragists in America. So she goes to his store to see if she can cash a check. Well, he takes one look at Miss Lucy and he falls in love head over heels, and he declares his love for her. And Lucy tells him to go kick rocks. In 1850, women didn't have a whole lot of rights, but single women had a heck of a lot more rights than married women, and Lucy knew this. Single women could have jobs, they could own property, they could do business, they could keep their own wages. Once they were married, they lost all this. So she told Henry, no thanks, I'll be seeing you. Well, Henry wasn't so willing to give up, so he proposed a business deal. He said, well, if you won't marry me, then can I be your secretary? I will schedule your tours and fundraise so you can have money travel across the country promoting women's rights. Lucy agrees to this, but after about 4 years, realizes that she too has fallen in love with Henry, and she really can't deny it. So she doesn't know what to do. She tells him she loves him, but she can't marry him. Well, Henry talks to one of his attorney friends, and the attorney friend makes a suggestion, which will become the first prenuptial agreement in the United States. Basically, in this prenuptial agreement, Henry promises her that she will have her independence and equality. She will be allowed to maintain any of her property that she has now or purchases during their marriage. She can keep all of her own wages, do her own business. Anything that she does is hers to keep and hers to own. He will take none of it. He also promises her legally autonomy over her own body, that basically she will be the one who determines when they have relations and when they don't. And he makes a very unusual agreement for the time. He promises that he will do half of the housework and half of the child rearing, so the two of them can both have careers and be in the home. So Lucy sees a good thing, and she marries Henry. She does maintain her maiden name after marriage. A lot of times you'll see her name written as Lucy Stone Blackwell, and people assume that she hyphenated her name. She did, but not for the reason you think. What happened was that after she got married, even though Henry had given her rights, given her equality, the men and the businessmen, probably in Cincinnati, didn't really care, and they told her that Lucy Stone didn't exist, because Lucy Stone was now married, so she was Lucy Blackwell. She was the property of her husband. So a famous attorney by the name of Salmon P. Chase, some of you may have heard that name, suggests to Lucy that she hyphenate her name. That way she can maintain her independence and appease the business community. So that is actually why she hyphenates her name, not for any other reason. The next rebel of reason, I like to call her, is Antoinette Brown, and she's tired of the men in religion. She's actually best friends with Lucy Stone. They met at Oberlin College. And when Lucy marries Henry, Antoinette sees a good thing, so she actually marries Samuel Blackwell, Henry's brother. And he signs the same type of prenuptial agreement that Henry agreed to. And ironically enough, history has seen that both of those two men not only kept their agreements, they were happy and proud to do so throughout their marriage. But Antoinette decided she was tired of only men running the religion show, and she decided she wanted to become a minister. So in 1849, she actually becomes the first woman minister of a mainstream religion in America. She's a Presbyterian minister. The next rebel of reason is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner's just tired of men completely, and she's tired of their benevolent sexism. You probably know her best for her "Ain't I a Woman" speech, which was actually not real. The speech was real, but it was sort of whitewashed. Sojourner Truth was a self-emancipated former slave. What that means is she escaped and ran away from the plantation and freed herself. And she actually came to Pennsylvania, to the Dutch area. And she was actually very well educated and very well spoken. So she did, the "Ain't I a Woman" speech is real. However, she never would have said "Ain't I a woman." She actually spoke with more of a proper English accent and said, "Am I not a woman?" And she spoke in a very proper way. And that's something that is being taught to people now, because the "Ain't I a Woman" is very slangy and sounds like she's uneducated, and that was not true of her. And people want, a lot of women historians want people to know that Sojourner Truth was very well spoken and never said, "Ain't I a woman?" to anybody. She did say that, but she probably said, am I not a woman? Is what. Anyway, another thing about Sojourner Truth is she was often accused of being manly because she was so strong and tenacious. So one of her other claims to fame was that she was at a speech and a man accused her of being a man. So she responded by tearing open her shirt and baring her breasts and saying, "Yep, I'm a woman." So she challenged the whole notion of what a woman is. So that a woman doesn't have to be a fragile lady of society, that women are strong and they go to work and they do hard work, they lift things, they can do all the things that men can do. She really challenged the notion of the gentle, weak woman. And the next rebel of reason that I just want to mention is Elizabeth Blackwell. She got tired of male doctors. She's from Cincinnati. She is the sister to Samuel and Henry Blackwell. And I did not mention the Blackwells actually lived in a house up on Gilbert Avenue where Jim and Eddie's is currently located. So they were just right next door to the Lane Seminary and about a block away from the Beecher household. So to no one's surprise, she and Harriet Beecher Stowe were very good friends. And Harriet is one of the people that encouraged her to become a doctor. Again, she also had brothers in the suffrage movement, so no doubt they encouraged her as well. So she, when she shared her dream and her brothers and her friends said you should go for it, she started to send out her applications. One by one, colleges denied her because women were just starting to even be allowed in college, let alone going to medical school. But eventually, a college in New York got her application. It was the Geneva Medical College, and they thought it was kind of a joke, so they decided to let their student body have a little fun and vote on it. And the student body voted to let her come, mostly because they figured she wouldn't. Well, she not only showed up on that first day of classes, she actually graduated first in her class. And then a year later brought her younger sister, Emily, into the fold, who became the third female doctor in the United States. During the Civil War, Elizabeth would run the Sanitation Commission, and she's known for helping to found the Good Samaritan Hospital there on Clifton Avenue during the Civil War as a hospital for soldiers who were injured in the war. She will also go on with her sister to start a women's medical college as well as a women's hospital in New York. And she'll continue to advocate for women's rights, including suffrage and women's health care. So the next set of rebels that I came up with was after the Civil War. I called them the rebels of rabble rousing. And they kind of ran the scene from 1860 to 1900. And I said, basically, they had fun stirring up shit one action at a time because they just kind of like to pick at people. The rebels of reason were very ladylike. They followed the laws. They did what they were supposed to do. They were radical, but they were professional about it. 1860, the Civil War, once it comes to an end, things change. And they get annoyed, and so they start rebel rousing. In 1860, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will actually hold a convention that will call for universal suffrage, meaning that any adult in the United States, regardless of race or gender, can vote. Unfortunately, the Republican men reject this motion because they want to focus on giving the vote to Black men. Now, their reasons for doing that was they knew they could count on the support of all Black men, but if they gave women the right to vote, they were afraid that the women in the South, particularly, would vote to support white supremacy and would continue to try to bring slavery back or to keep Black Americans oppressed. But Susan and Elizabeth weren't very happy about it. They felt very hurt and betrayed, especially when Frederick Douglass defended this idea and said that this was the hour of the Negro, his words, which would have been appropriate for the time. And Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass had a short falling out after this, and some things were said that weren't very nice, but they were very racist. But again, these women were very hurt and angry and felt very betrayed because they had worked so hard alongside the abolitionists and the civil rights people to only have to be rejected by them. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony, I mentioned in 1870, the 15th Amendment passes. So in 1872, Susan B. Anthony decides to challenge things and she decides to vote. She gets arrested for voting illegally and she goes on trial. This was major because if she was found not guilty, that would instantly give all women in America the right to vote. It was a huge deal, and after both sides presented their defense and their whatevers, the judge looked at the jury and ordered them to find Miss Anthony guilty. So really, she didn't have a chance. So of course they found her guilty, and the judge fined her $100, for which she said, "I will never pay $1 of it." She left that day not paying, and she never did pay. And she actually remains on the books as a felon for her refusal to pay her fine. Also at the same time, Miss Victoria Woodhull will decide to run for president in 1872 as well, the same year. Victoria is also from Ohio. She's from Homer, Ohio. And she was actually born to a family of con artists. I love her story. She's one of my favorite people because her family, they were basically con people, and her town loved the family so much, I always say, that they decided to hold a fundraiser in order to raise the funds so the Woodhulls could leave town. So they basically left town and they went on the road and started kind of like this traveling show where Victoria was a fortune teller. At the age of 16, she does meet a doctor from Cincinnati who she marries and does move to Cincinnati for some time. But unfortunately for her, the marriage doesn't work out. So she returns back to her family's traveling show and goes back to reading fortunes. But eventually she starts to think that maybe her skills could be used better. And she decides that maybe these skills that she uses to tell fortunes are probably the same skills that men in finance use to sell stocks. So she decides to become a stockbroker. She goes to New York and manages to meet Cornelius Vanderbilt, practically she steps off the train, and he falls head over heels for her, and basically will help her set up her own stock brokerage, which she becomes very wealthy, and then starts her own women's newspaper advocating for women's rights. But in 1872, she decides to run for president, and she declares Frederick Douglass her VP, but she forgot to tell him. So he was a little surprised when the newspaper people asked him about his run for VP. He didn't know what they were talking about, but they ran on the equality ticket. Well, but like he kind of did. He was kind of, nominated to run, but he didn't, like I said, he didn't know. But of course, she didn't win. She wasn't even 35. So had she won, she wouldn't have even been able to be president. She was actually spent election night in jail because basically what happened was, I tell people that Victoria Woodhull, she made Bernie Sanders look conservative. Even in 1872, she was quite impressive and quite progressive. She not only supported suffrage, she supported full equality for women. She supported civil rights. She was actually talking about universal health care in 1872. She was using different words for it. She was talking about welfare. She was talking about Social Security, again, using different words, but same idea. She was talking about a universal basic income in 1872. Take that, Mr. Yang. She was just doing some wild stuff. But one of her problems was that one of her other platforms was called free love. I was told by a teenager today we call that hookup culture. And she supported that quite strongly. And Henry Ward Beecher, the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, by this time had become the most famous minister in America. And he was a suffragist. He actually will be the president of the American Women's Association at one point. So he supports suffrage, but he's really put off by Victoria and her free love stuff. So he denounces her from the pulpit. And she responds in kind by that newspaper that she had, the Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly. She posts on the front page, the monster scandal in Plymouth Church. And basically what she tells them is that the good Reverend Beecher is a hypocrite because the good Reverend Beecher has been carrying on with one of his parishioners, Elizabeth Tilton. And so she exposes his very long affair that he's had for quite several years. And Henry is infuriated, and because he is a man with power, he has her arrested for obscenity for putting this in the paper. So she actually spends election night in jail, even though they eventually have to release her because they don't have any evidence to really hold her. But she was actually planning on voting with Susan, and I don't know with Susan, but she was planning on voting and did not get to. The next woman I want to tell you about is this lady, one of my favorite suffragists. I just learned about her this year. Mary Church Terrell. She advocates for the suffrage of women of color. She not only takes on the patriarchy, she takes on the women too. She actually takes on Susan B. Anthony. In 1891, she attends I'm going to call it the NASA meeting. It's the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And Susan B. Anthony is the president at this time, and she attends one of the meetings. And Susan opens up the floor for anyone to speak, and Mary Church Terrell raises her hand and says, I have something to say. And Susan, okay. And she says, as a colored woman, I hope this association will include in the resolution injustices of various kinds of which colored people are the victims. Susan B. Anthony is kind of startled, but she admits that she had not thought of that, and she does something that is amazing. She does what Frederick Douglass did for women at the suffrage convention. She gives Mary Church Terrell the mic. They didn't have mics, but she brought her up front and she said, tell us about it. She gives her the floor. Mary Church talks about what women of color are going through. Susan invites her to join the organization because Mary is not a member, and says, we will work together on this. And they do form a friendship, and they work together for suffrage for many years, like the friendship between Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. Frederick disappointed Susan when he didn't defend her rights for the 15th Amendment. Mary will be very disappointed in Susan when Susan often chooses white women and their issues over the issues of color, Black women of color. So kind of interesting that Susan does to Mary what Frederick did to her that made her so hurt and angry. And she kind of sad that she didn't really learn from it. The next rebel rouser that liked to cause trouble was Frances Willard. She started the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they will endorse suffrage. At this time in history, temperance is a very progressive movement. For us today, we can't imagine that, but I tell people to think of it as an early domestic violence protection program. At this time in history, even women's suffrage, even your suffragists aren't at a point where they're seeing women as fully independent. They still, not that they think women are property, but they still, parts of them, they're not where we are today. So women don't have property, they don't have access to money, the laws don't protect them, and men are going out and drinking heavily, coming home, beating their wives, raping their wives, spending all the money. And so the temperance workers, their philosophy is, if we can get rid of alcohol, we can stop men from drinking, and then they'll be better people and treat their families better. So it was really a way to stop abuse. It wasn't really like drinking of the devil or something like that that we often think of today. They didn't see it that way at all. They saw it as a way to protect women and children. One of the more interesting things that I learned about Frances Willard is, and I did not know this, she is actually a lesbian. And there were several there were several queer women in the community that supported suffrage. And I just have some pictures here of a few that I'm going to tell you about. Let's see, here to the left, the woman, the very beautiful woman with her hair up in a bun. Let me get her name. That is Mrs. Dunbar, the wife of the poet. I'm sorry, why don't I have his name written down? Sorry. Let me get the names here real quick.
Paul Dunbar?
Yes, thank you. For some reason, I didn't write down these women's names. I don't know why. Yes, Alice Dunbar Nelson, excuse me. And after he dies, she will actually be very openly bisexual. Up at the top, we have Carrie Chapman Catt and Louisa Hay, who live together as a lesbian couple. They're not open about it, but we know from reading their writings and things like that that's what's going on. Down here in the bottom, the two women in the chair. This is Anna Shaw to the right and Lucy Anthony to the left, Susan B. Anthony's niece. And they live fairly openly as a lesbian couple most of their life. Again, they don't ever talk about it. They call these things Boston marriages. But again, we know from their writings that this was not any kind of friendship. This was more than a friendship. To the right of them, we have Jane Addams, the great woman who started social work. And she was a suffrage also with her partner. And then above her, I have Alice Stone Blackwell. She is Lucy and Henry's daughter, and she will be instrumental in helping reunite the National Women's Association and the American Women's Association. And she's also bisexual. And then up at the right, I have Belle Squire, this ad that says, would you rather have a vote than a husband? Belle says yes. Belle was asexual and openly happy to be so. So just want to give you some, that they were there and they were questioning the norms of society back in from 1860 to the 1900s. They were around. In Cincinnati, we had some doctors that were challenging the norms. We had 3 doctors that were starting to advocate for women's health care. One of the benefits to Elizabeth Blackwell becoming a doctor is that she opened the door for other women to follow. And by the 1880s or so, becoming a doctor is one of the most popular professions for women. These 3 women all practice in Cincinnati. Dr. Sowers will have an office down on across from the Federal Building on Main Street and 6th. Dr. Elizabeth Campbell will work at Christ Hospital. And Dr. Louisa Southgate will actually have a practice in Northern Kentucky across the river, but she'll practice at some of the hospitals in Cincinnati. All three of these women will advocate for reproductive rights for women in addition to being leaders in the suffrage movement. Sarah will be the president of the Susan B. Anthony Club. She's also known because when she was at a conference on a maternity conference, the doctor in charge was explaining to the students about how it was perfectly acceptable that women suffered during labor because Adam and Eve, and that it was probably a blessing the more they suffered because that meant they were good Christian women. Sarah Sowers pretty much gave him a what for, and then went on to become a pioneer in advocating for pain relief during childbirth. So I've not had children, but to those of you who have had them, you can salute her if you got any kind of medication or anything to help with the pain during the process. Elizabeth Campbell had a birth control clinic at Christ Hospital, but after some Catholic organizations started protesting, Christ Hospital forced her to move her clinic to a private location. And then Louisa Southgate would be a very open, very loud advocate for birth control for women in the Cincinnati area. So all of these women, and she would be the president of the 20th Century Club, and Dr. Campbell would be involved with the Central Suffrage Committee. So all three of these women would advocate for suffrage and women's health care, and they would help to make women's health care a issue within the women's rights battle after suffrage because of their dedication to women's health care. The next women that like to cause trouble were the newswomen. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott started their convention, the press just kind of either ignored them or mocked them. They weren't really able to get into the mainstream papers. So a lot of women started to write their own newspapers and journals. And they would start to advocate for women's suffrage and women's issues. Some of the papers, the first group were nonpartisan papers that actually supported suffrage but weren't exclusive to suffrage. The first one would be the Free Inquirer magazine. In 1828, written by Fanny Wright. This was actually a free thought magazine focusing on atheism, social justice, feminism, and suffrage. Frederick Douglass in 1847 would put out the North Star, in which he would openly advocate for suffrage for both people of color and women. And in 1849, Amelia Bloomer would start writing The Lily, which was a newspaper for temperance, but in it she would also advocate for suffrage for women. According to my research, the suffrage newspapers that were exclusively about suffrage and women's rights started in 1853, and the first one was called the Una. However, I know for a fact that this paper that's pictured here in front of you, the Genius of Liberty from Cincinnati, started in 1851. So I question that fact about the Una, because this was started by Elizabeth Aldridge of the Mercantile Library, and it was a national paper. And it began in 1851. But in 1853, we had the Una. In 1868, we had the Revolution, which was written by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Another tie to Cincinnati, they did ask Harriet Beecher Stowe to be the editor of the magazine and to take it over. However, her sister Catherine, who was an anti-suffrage, didn't support suffrage, had such a fit. Harriet asked them to change the name of the Revolution to something a little more, not quite so rebellious. And they decided not to do that. So she declined to run the paper, which is kind of why she was a suffragist but was never a mainstream suffragist because she tried to appease her sister and stay out of the limelight too much. Lucy Stone started the Women's Journal in 1870, and in 1894, Josephine Ruffin started the first African-American women's suffrage magazine called the Women's Era. So by 1900, we had over 250 papers and journals for women's suffrage. And now we're going to move into the final era of the suffrage movement, and I call these the 20th century radical rebels. These were the women that got stuff done. You know, the reasonable women, they tried to work with the system. And then the rebel rousers just tried to cause trouble and stir things up. The radical women, they're done. They're not taking it anymore. They're not playing games. They're getting what they want. So many of them will study with the British suffragettes over in England, who have very in-your-face, sometimes violent methods of getting what they want. And the first one I want to talk about is Harriet Stanton. Blatch. She is the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And when you're a rebel of reason, your daughter has to rebel somehow. So Harriet goes to Britain and decides to be unreasonable, because Harriet says we cannot win by reason, we must win by emotion. So she advocates lavish parades, lavish public displays. Basically, I call it the hooray for Hollywood look of suffrage. She comes back from England in 1902 and will start trying to reinvigorate the movement and make it more of a spectacle. Actually, her first move is to start advocating or start to bring in working class women. She does that by forming the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women, which is basically a suffrage organization for working class women. They have 20,000 members, and they lead different parades and protests. They actually win equal pay for women in New York, for school teachers, women school teachers in New York, as a result of their protest. Stanton said that suffragists really needed to appeal more to emotions than to reason to get the vote. The movement has to be striking to the eye. It has to be a spectacle to grab the headlines. Whereas early suffragists created their own newspapers when they got ignored, Stanton and the newer breed that are coming in decide to make them pay attention and make them give them headlines. So in 1912, let me start from, so she starts advocating, I'm sorry, let me back up. I'm going to go back to the first parade. So some of the things that she will advocate for, their parades, their pageants, soapboxing, which is literally when you stand on soapboxes and yell and tell people what you think. They will have demonstrations and mass gatherings. The first parade, I love this story. It's 6 women in New York City, and they're going to march down 5th Street. At this time, this is so crazy because these are middle class, well-bred women, and they've got their banners and their white dresses and their voting sashes, and there's 6 of them, mind you, and they go marching down 5th Street, and the police are like, what are they doing? And so they start following them, and by the time they get to the other end of 5th Street, they have 1,000 people following them, trying to figure out what's going on. Well, it made headlines. It made like 12 different papers, which was huge. That was the first time really that suffrage made headlines in a mainstream paper. So this really starts to invigorate the suffragists, and they start saying, this is how we get headlines. So they start having these parades. Actually, in 1912, Columbus, Ohio will hold a parade because we're trying to get the right to vote in Ohio. and they will hold a parade to try to make friends with the German community. They handed out, during this time, they handed out 20,000 pamphlets to local Ohioans. And they tried to convince them that they wouldn't overthrow, or they wouldn't vote intemperance if they would support them. Another thing was they had the transcontinental tour of suffragists led by Mabel Vernon. They actually traveled across the country speaking and leading demonstrations for women's suffrage. And one local woman that participated in this was Helen Manning Taft, the daughter of William H. Taft. So kind of a fun thing to do. And they just engaged in relentless lobbying, publicity stunts, repeated acts of nonviolent confrontation, and acts of civil disobedience. So the next radical rebel would be, again, back to Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells. During the Washington parade, Alice Paul she didn't want African-American women in the parade because she wanted to please the Southern women. But then she relented and agreed that they could come, but they had to march in the back. So Mary and Ida and several of their friends basically hid in the crowds. And when the parade started, they all jumped in the middle of the parade and marched wherever they chose to march with their own groups or whatever, but they did not march in the back. So they were kind of women to be amazing. And then we also have Inez Milholland. She was the woman on the white horse. She came from a prominent, wealthy family, and she was a leading socialist of the day. She advocated for labor rights, and her claim to fame was basically announcing the Women's March on the white horse. She was considered the most beautiful woman the most beautiful suffragist. Another woman who was out and proud and loud was Alice Duell Miller. I love this woman. She cracks me up. She was actually a journalist, and she was kind of the Jon Stewart of her day. She would write what they called were poems, but they were really more like the monologues that you would see on a late night show. And this one is like, "Are women people?" And I'll just read this to you. It's kind of fun. Father, what is a legislator? Father, what is a legislature? A representative body elected by the people of the state. Are women people? No, my son. Criminals, lunatics, and women are not people. Do legislatures legislate for nothing? Oh no, they are paid a salary. By whom? By the people. Are women people? Of course, my son, just as much as men are. So, basically, they weren't people when it came to voting, but they were people when it came to paying taxes. She also wrote Why We Oppose Pockets for Women. And my favorite one was that it would destroy men's pride, as they could no longer be chivalrous towards women if they didn't have to carry all of her things in his pocket. And Vice President Marshall, when he was asked if he supported suffrage, he said no, and they asked him to justify it. And he said, my wife is against suffrage, and that settles it. That settles me. So Alice responded by saying, my wife dislikes the income tax, so I cannot pay it. She thinks that golf, all interest lacks. So now I shall never play it. She is opposed to tolls repeal, the why I cannot say, but woman's duty is to feel and man's is to obey. So I like that. And then the other radical rebel I'm going to tell you about is Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the president of the National Association of Women, National American Women's Suffrage Association. When Tennessee, when we start to get suffrage, when they're up to be the 36th state to vote on ratification, she goes down to Tennessee to train the suffragists on how to talk and deal with these people. And they're actually buying out and committing, like, they're basically trying to bribe the officials. So she keeps books. She keeps 2 sets of books. The first one she keeps is a book on who promises to support the suffrage movement. And then the second book she keeps, after doing research, is which ones can be bribed because they're involved in blackmail or they've done something scandalous. And then she matches them up to see who's lying to her. But what I love about her is on the evening of the vote, the anti-suffragists have a big party and they bring all the legislators in to basically get them drunk. They call it the Jack Daniels Suite, as in a hotel suite. It's a pop-up speakeasy at a local hotel. And the plan is to liquor up the men so basically they're so drunk the next morning they don't show up to vote. Kat actually gets people to go in and spy and find out who's there. And then the next morning, all the suffragists show up and they drag all the men back to their hotel rooms, get them showered, get them coffeed, sobered up, and get them to the vote. So I think that's kind of fun that she did that. So somehow I skipped Alice Paul, so I'm going to give you a little bit about Alice Paul too. Harriet Stanton Blatch, she introduces Alice Paul and Lucy Burns to Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Shaw, who are heading NASWA. They, of course, have also studied with the Brits, and they have very radical ideas, and that's why Harriet recommends them. And they will run the Washington Parade in 1913. The Washington Parade is a huge cornerstone for the suffrage movement, because what happens is they have this huge parade with all these banners and everything's going great. 20,000 women show up to march, and then the men turn violent and go after them. Now, Alice Paul, actually, let me back up a little and tell you, Alice Paul, she actually, when she sets this parade up, the chief of police tells her that she can't have this march because she wants to have it the night before the inauguration. He says, you can't have it next week. Alice Paul just looks at him and says, no, I'm having it the night before the inauguration. He says, okay, well, you can't walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. She says, well, you were walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, get over it. I don't know how she got away with it, but she did. But then he told her, well, you won't have any police protection. She says, fine. So she has her big parade, everything's going well, things turn violent. The police end up getting investigated for not protecting them. And this is the first time that the mainstream newspaper starts to look sympathetically at the suffragists. And the public opinion on them starts to turn because they start to feel bad because they're just like, well, they shouldn't have been beaten up just because they wanted the right to vote. So after this, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, they will become experts at rebelling. And their big thing is to embarrass Woodrow Wilson now that he's president. So they become relentless with lobbying and picketing. They picket the White House daily. They get like 2,000 women and they just do it in shifts every day. What I love is that Mary Church Terrell, the woman who was told by Alice Paul she couldn't march with them and had to march in the back, says she does not give up on Alice Paul because she comes and pickets with her arm in arm. And they continue to, she says she learned the difference between an ally and a friend. and they continue to work together for many years. But essentially, I forgot my, hold on here. Why isn't my screen moving? Hey, wait. Okay, so, but essentially, okay, let me find out where I was. I apologize. They're doing their picketing and they're demonstrating, and the police come, and men will start attacking them and causing trouble. Instead of arresting the men, they arrest the women. And as the women are arrested, they start getting press. They eventually, while they're in prison, they're beaten, they're force-fed, they're abused, and they're leaking their stories to the press that are making it in the press. And people are horrified by this. And this is all part of Alice's strategy to get the vote. As the public gets more and more upset, other countries are starting to give women the right to vote, including Russia, sadly. I think I skipped a section, so I'm just gonna. Here's the women protesting. Russia gets the right to vote in 1917. So now things are really bad publicly because we claim to be this democracy, and yet we're beating and imprisoning our women for asking for the right to vote. And Russia, the communist nation, is giving their women the right to vote. So things are changing. The press is reporting on this every day. They're sending out pictures of the women being force-fed. And just the public opinion is changing. World War II opens up. When World War II opens up, women go to the factories and in the businesses to run the country while the men are away. And in the continued stories of abuse and torture at the prisons and the women's efforts for the war, the public starts to demand that women be given the right to vote. So in 1918, Woodrow Wilson will address Congress and he will call for them to pass the 19th Amendment. In 1919, the Women's Suffrage Amendment of 1878 will be reintroduced to Congress. At this time, Wilson will endorse it, and 36 states will be needed for passage. The 36th state, of course, is Tennessee, and this is where Carrie goes down to Tennessee to help get the drunk sobered up. But ultimately, we win our vote because of this woman on the left, Feb Byrne. Her son, Harry Byrne, is part of the legislature who's going to be voting. He initially does support suffrage, but because of all that, those cons going on and all the people blackmailing and doing bad things, some people that he respects tells him that his district doesn't support suffrage. At the time, if you're voting for suffrage, you wear a yellow rose. If you're not voting for suffrage, you wear a red rose. So he's wearing a yellow rose. He switches to the red rose because they tell him, if you vote for suffrage, then you won't get any support. You won't get reelected. August 18th at 10 a.m. as he's going into the Capitol building, a page comes and hands him his mail for the day. In that mail is a letter from his mother, Feb Byrne, on the left. And in that letter, she tells him not to worry about reelection or his career. She says, hurrah, vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Miss Cat with her rat, i.e. ratification. He does the right thing, decides to vote, totally surprises. The women they're counting the roses, and then they figure they're gonna lose. And he says aye instead of nay. And like there's silence. And then suddenly the women, it hits them what just happened. And they realize that suffrage has been won. So there's like pandemonium in the state house. Afterwards, when he's interviewed, he says, I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. I appreciated the fact that an opportunity as such rarely comes to a mortal man to free 17 million women from political slavery. And that opportunity was mine. So on August 18th, 1920, Harry Byrne will vote yay, giving women in America the right to vote, thanks to his mother. Here's one of the headlines of the Dayton paper. And I did the math on this. And according to my information, on November 2nd, 1920, there was approximately 936,000 women in America who voted. In Cincinnati, that would have been 50,377 who voted in their first election. Over on the right, the Reverend Antoinette Brown, the one who married Samuel Blackwell, the brother of Henry Blackwell, will be the only suffragette who's still alive to vote. Every single suffragist who was of the original group have passed away. She's the last living suffragist to vote. So basically what it comes down to is that, 1912, 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns come into the scene, and they've really been trained by the radicals in Britain. And with Harriet Stanton's support, they're able to get into the movement, and they change things. And they basically take the British methods and use those to force the country to give women the vote. They learn how to use picketing and demonstrations and civil disobedience to make headlines. They learned how to embarrass people and how to use pressure. Another thing that Alice Paul is very good at, which I think is unusual, is that she, as sexist as this may sound, she actually realized that a lot of the stereotypes around suffrage was that the suffragists were old and ugly. So she always made sure to put her youngest and prettiest suffragists in the front so that everything looked pretty. They made beautiful banners. They just did these public displays and spectacles, which got the eye of the media. And then along with them getting exposed, their picketing and the abuse, they were able to manipulate the situation so that Wilson was essentially forced to support suffrage and to encourage Congress to support it because he was trying to save face. And that's basically how women got the right to vote in 1920.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
That was wonderful. That was wonderful. Very, so informative.
Yes, yes. Desiree, one of the questions, and you did touch on this, so I'm going to ask Bill too. Did Desiree answer your questions about the association between the temperance movement and the suffragist movement, or did you want to find out more about that?
She touched on it, but my understanding is that to some extent, the suffragist movement almost grew out of the temperance movement in terms of women's political involvement and stuff. And I wondered, is that accurate?
Yes and no. I think the suffrage movement grew out of both abolition and temperance.
Right, right.
It really, more so abolition in the beginning. And then after the 15th was ratified and women got basically left behind, then it became more the temperance movement. One of the things the temperance movement did for suffrage was Frances Willard, and I didn't mention this, she coined a phrase called home protection. Are you waving at me?
No.
She coined a phrase called home protection, and the idea was to protect the home and protect your children and your home by banning alcohol. And so if we give women the right to vote, they can protect their families with the vote. And that phrase, home protection, made suffrage more palatable to the more conservative women, because the reasonable rebels, as I was calling them, they wanted to vote because they were equals. The temperance union wanted women to vote so they could save the family. So it's kind of like the party of family values. They kind of mixed this family values idea and kind of left out the equality. And so like your average woman who wasn't really ready to hear about equality felt better about voting for this. If that makes.
And then do you know if Lucy Stone was the first woman to hyphenate her name?
Yes.
Oh, she was. Okay.
Because Salmon P. Chase was the one who told her to do it, because she kept her name. She was the first woman to keep her name after marriage, but then the businessmen in town told her she didn't exist. So Salmon P. said, well, this is something you could do. So as far as we know, she's on record as being the first prenuptial agreement and the first to keep her name and the first to hyphenate her name.
That's really fascinating, because when I took a course at undergrad at UC, I didn't learn anything about the Cincinnati. You know, you learn about Seneca Falls and all that, but nothing about Cincinnati. Did Cincinnati have a reputation for being a hotbed of undisciplined women?
No, not at all, actually. And that's what I realized. I missed a section. Not at all, actually. They were really, a lot of the reasonable women, I called them, came out of Cincinnati. At the time the suffrage movement was beginning, Cincinnati was very big nationally. But so we were very progressive. We had a lot of progressives. But
That's
they
what I
weren't
meant.
necessarily bad behaving. Because they were progressives within the rule of law. Like the Blackwells and like they were thinking outside the box, but they weren't like causing trouble.
Okay, yeah, that's what I meant. That,
Yeah.
but we did have a following here. The reason that I asked, and the reason that when you were interviewing women who voted in that first election in 1920, Cincinnati women, that I'm so fascinated about that, because I call her my grandma, but she was actually my great aunt, and I know she voted in that election, and she was not overtly but covertly really taught me how to stand up for myself and be the person I am today. So what did you glean from that knowledge, interviewing the women?
Well, I think what was surprising to me was that it was kind of a variety. I've always shared my favorite story, that those who have heard me speak before have heard about the woman who voted and her beau. I guess I'll just tell it. She was always my favorite. It's a story I remember the best. When she voted, I asked her how her family and the men in her life, like her father, how did people react when you told them you were going to vote? And she said her beau was tickled pink. And he showed up on election day morning with a corsage and escorted her to the polls, and then took her out for breakfast, and then spent the next several hours walking her through town, introducing her to everyone they saw as this modern woman. Meet my modern woman. And she just voted. So, I mean, you hear these horrible stories about people throwing eggs at the women. I never heard any of that. Most of it was just, that was one most wonderful story. Surprisingly, most of the women were just kind of like, yeah, I voted, no big deal. They didn't really, it wasn't, I would have thought it'd been more memorable. Because the other one, I remember she voted and she thought it was great. She loved it. But she said in the same breath, but I'm not ready for a woman president. And that's
really?
No, that was in 1980. So that was like when Mondale and Ferraro were running. She was like not ready for that. She was not down for that. But she thought, oh, I think it's great that women get to vote, but I'm not down for this woman president thing. I was like, okay. Yeah. So, yeah.
Does anybody have any other questions?
We can unmute now if we behave ourselves.
Yeah.
I could chime in with something if that's
Go,
all right.
Bill. Yeah.
A couple things. One, I'm hoping you'll talk more about the black-white divide and the challenges that created in the women's movement.
Yeah,
But
that's a really awkward, it's, yeah, first of all, I do want to apologize. Somehow, I don't know what I did, but I lost my paragraph on Alice Ball in the beginning. So she kind of got overlooked and I didn't mean,
Okay.
I did get back to her, but I had more, you know, so I apologize. It was like,
No, don't
So anyway,
apologize. We need
but,
you
so
more
the-
than.
Oh, yeah, it was
No,
rude.
don't.
race-
That's fine. That's
The
fine.
15th Amendment, let's get back to that. So I mentioned, I think that Katie Stanton and Simpson B. Anthony kind of knew what was coming because they almost immediately, even before the war was over, introduced the idea of universal suffrage. I mean, I think they knew what was coming. And I think they knew what the Republican men were up to. And I actually did the numbers. There was like, if you had given all women the right to vote, you would have added like 7 million voters, but they could vote either way. If you gave just black men the right to vote, you would add about 2.5 million voters to the election, but they would all vote Republican. So remember, Republicans were the progressives at this time. So I don't agree, but I understand their thinking because they were afraid of is that if white women were given the right to vote, the women in the South would vote to uphold like Jim Crow type laws. Ironically, it happened anyway. But I mean, you know, even without women voting, the men did it. So just like temperance, they were terrified to give women the vote because they would vote in temperance, but the men voted in temperance. That happened before 1920, so it just kind of is interesting. But that was really their rationale, was they were terrified of Southern white women and what they would do. I think Frederick Douglass's heart was in the right place because he felt like we give black men the vote, we can help black Americans rise up. If we give women the right to vote, those Southern white women, there's enough of them that they could cause problems for black Americans and keep them down. Was kind of their thinking. I don't know if that was really true because all those women could have, you know, but they were looking probably at the numbers. I mean, there's more Southern women than there are black men, but then I don't know if they were counting the black women. You know, I mean, I look at it. I understand what they're thinking. I don't necessarily morally agree with it.
Of course not.
well, there were.
What would you do in that time? And then on the other hand, the other thing I bring up is people get upset about the suffragists saying they were racist.
Say, can I ask a question?
The whole racism thing. And I think, again, I'm not defending their position. I'm asking you to put yourself in their place. Most of these women were educated women who had spent the last 20, 30 years advocating to free the enslaved people. And the Republicans now wanted to give those enslaved people that they had been advocating for more rights and the rights to them and deny them the rights they had been advocating for. So some of the things that Katie Stanton said about you're going to give it to these uneducated people, well, she was an educated woman who I can understand why she was angry. I mean, it's like not, I get the big picture, but also, you know, I'm an educated woman that's been politically active for 30 years, been actually helping these people, and we're going to give them the rights that you're, and deny me the same rights, but give them to them. And it's like, well, yeah, I kind of get why she was mad.
Right. So the
I did
reason
all
I
this work, and you're going to give what I would give the vote to them, but not me.
one of the reasons I brought it up is that back in whatever 48, right, when the Seneca Falls conference happened,
Mhm.
that was a pretty white event. In fact, almost entirely. And
Frederick Douglass was
Frederick Douglass was the exception to that, and also one of the handful of men. And that was not a suffragist conference. That was a women's rights conference. And in fact, suffrage was not going to be on the bill at all.
right now.
And,
We talked about that was number
and-
9, and Frederick Douglass, yeah.
And Douglass went to Cady Stanton and urged her to put it on the bill,
Right.
even though they both knew it probably wouldn't pass. So the next day, as you mentioned, he gave up and gave a speech. It was considered one of the best speeches of his career. It was very impactful. It had people weeping. And by the end of his speech, he had completely flipped the room and got a nearly unanimous agreement to put suffrage on the ballot. And one of the things he said was he could not in good conscience support the right of suffrage for Blacks and not support it for women.
Right. And then he said
Can
that
I,
as well. So
can
that's what,
I,
yeah.
huh?
Let her finish, Giovanni, and then we'll get, yeah, Giovanni's next after you finish your answer, Desiree.
No, I just said, yeah, I agree, yeah. We
Okay.
need that, but, and to be fair to Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony kind of did the same thing to Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells. You know, after she called Ida B. Wells up on the stage and asked her to participate and be part of the movement, then she kind of turned, she didn't defend the women, she didn't defend marriage for Black women. She didn't really help them much after that. She made a lot of decisions that were expedient to getting the right to vote for white women because they wanted to please the Southern people to get the vote. Like the whole putting the no Black women in the parade. This is post Susan, but even with Alice Paul, the Washington parade stuff was really to please the Southern women. I don't know why these women of the South have so much power, but they do. They caused the problems in the 15th Amendment, and now they're causing the problems later on. Because like a lot of, for example, the National Association, the NASWA, that's what I call it, the rules for the organization were state by state. So in New York, they may not deny membership to African Americans, but in Georgia, they might. And nobody forced Georgia to admit African American women into the group. So they were always trying to please those Southern women. And unfortunately,
Giovanni, what did you have?
Yes, thank you, Desiree, for your enlightening presentation. I would like to ask you, as you know, the labor unions were basically crushed in the 20s.
right,
And they resurrected in the 30s after the crash of the Wall Street crash, which causes the Great Depression. What role did women groups have in the U.S. labor war was very violent. Hundreds died in the sit-ins, the strikes of the 30s, and the resurgence of the labor movement, which forced Roosevelt to implement the New Deal. The women organization, what role do they have in that?
the 1930s, I'm not really sure. I mean, I know as far as like they were in the 1920s, those eras, they were starting to, like Harriet Stanton was bringing them into the fold. Inez Mulholland was a labor union support. She advocated for labor unions because she was a socialist. But I don't know that they were there during the violent times. Just more that they were trying to get them into the suffrage movement. in like 1910 to 1920. I know that with Inez Milholland, the horse lady, she was very wealthy. And one of the things I read was that when they would have protests, the labor unions would do their strikes and things. She would pay for their bail when they would get arrested, and she would pay their fines because she knew they couldn't afford it. So that kind of helped. That's the one thing I do remember about her. That's how she would get them to protest with her, because they would know even if they got arrested, she'd get them out.
Giovanni, I've read a little bit about women in the labor movement, and primarily in Europe in the 30s, because there were a lot of Jewish women in the labor movement in the 30s. And I think it was more prevalent.
Mostly in the Communist Party.
Yes.
Most of them in the Communist Party. I'm European. I know that stuff.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
No, I don't know much about
I
the
know rubies.
And plus, I would like to add another. I always had the problem with the first woman. For example, the first woman president, that concept. I find that problematic. For example, take Hillary Clinton. This is the architect of, I can mention many, but the destruction of Libya's society, where I'm sure thousands, if not millions, hundreds of thousands of women suffered from the Libya had a pretty good economy where healthcare was available to everybody. Schools were free for everybody. And she was the architect of destroying the society. So the concept of the first woman president, I find that problematic. I mean, we can have many, for example, the coming to power Margaret Thatcher in England, where she destroyed the labor unions, just about. And the women, the wives of the miners, which she was at war with, what did they gain with Margaret Thatcher, the first woman prime minister? So I have that problem with when that is mentioned, the first woman president of the first. Now, I'm not saying that there are no women that we should support in those roles, but just with the concept of the first woman president or whatever, prime minister, it's a bit problematic. It depends on their policies and what class do they work for, they represent.
Can I jump in here for a minute?
Yeah.
Sure.
Giovanni, it's not, you have to look at the negative side too. It isn't just about promoting somebody to be the first woman president. It's also about the resistance that happens because it's a woman who is the candidate. It's a threshold. No matter what, it is a threshold. It's a barrier that has to be broken, you know. And so, yes, of course, it's important, character, politics, everything else. But still, the fact that it's a woman presents a barrier. And it's, you know, it's one that a lot of men and some women don't want to support, purely for that reason.
Exactly.
No, I would.
Very good point. It's not, I mean, it's like saying, finding O.J. Simpson and start scanning black people. I mean, it just stop.
Well, I would take Obama, for example. Let's take the first black president.
Yeah.
Voting for the first black president. 3,000 people dead, struck by his drone program, which 90% were civilians. People had nothing to do with terrorists. He killed an American, what was the name, Al-Arawi? Yeah, no, he didn't do anything except these fiery speeches. And then in true mafia mode, he killed the 16-year-old son in mafia mode because he feared he might come back for revenge. I can mention a pile of the Obama 8 years of Obama presidency.
Would you have preferred his opponent?
At least we know the devil we're fighting for. We fight against. His opponent was who? Romney.
And McCain.
Okay, take
Sarah
the.
Palin.
So you're
Well,
saying we could.
Well, take
rather have
take
the
his
person that has
I'm sorry. So it's the best of the two evils, the lesser of two evils choice. But
their gender and their race have nothing to do with those qualifications.
Here.
So
Exactly.
that's the important thing. Is like, yes,
I'm sorry.
what they
I'm sorry. I
stand
didn't
for.
get that. What
Their
was
gender and their race have nothing to do with their positions.
Well, that's my point.
It is difficult to get into office due to gender and race. But how they act once they're in office have nothing to do with them being female or black. That is on that individual's character. And again, I mean, you can look at our previous white male presidents and find plenty of issues.
Yeah, no more whites.
Yeah, why are you okay with
no more white
the
men.
horrible things that some of these white men have done, and you're not complaining about that?
Yeah.
So you condone the destruction of Libya to go over the barrier?
It's not because she was a woman. It's not because she was a woman.
Or he was a man.
It's not because she's a woman. I mean, if I had to pick between her and Donald Trump, she's winning all day long. I'm sorry,
if there's anything good we can get out of what Giovanni's saying, which I disagree with wholeheartedly, well, I think what he maybe not be expressing exactly that's okay is that it's probably not a good idea to vote for a woman because she's a woman or a black because he's black.
Well,
that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's a shade. That's a shade of your consideration, but it's not right. The rest
I have to disagree even with that premise, because
yes.
a lot of women are running saying that because of having been a power minority in America, and because of a lot of other things, they have experiences and understanding that the privileged white males don't have, and they bring that to the table, hopefully. And the same is true when you talk about race. So I think there is something to be said for supporting somebody because of race or gender.
I agree,
but that's not
the sole
necessarily
reason.
When you're talking about an individual person, they can be on either side of the spectrum, and you have to look at what they support and what they're against. Perfect example is who's being nominated tonight for the Supreme Court. It's a woman. So what?
Right.
We're not in favor of it. I'm not, anyways.
Right.
Right. Well, hopefully everyone understands what we're trying to say, which is that there are positive attributes that are connected to race and gender, and then there are irrelevancies to it. I wouldn't
have voted for Jesse Jackson. I mean, he's just not presidential material, right? When he was thinking about running.
Well, but I would have voted for Barbara Jordan.
I would have too, absolutely.
Sure.
And I would have, exactly.
Well, internationally, I think of Merkel and the Prime Minister of New Zealand as
Golda Meir. I don't know what she was.
And Golda Meir is another great example.
Indira Gandhi. None of them are free of mistakes. And by the way, can I make a motion to let's get back onto women's suffrage?
Are you trying to say they're human, Peter?
I'm working on it.
Okay. So I did have another question, which was, I sent it directly to you, Desiree, right at the beginning, when you were talking about Henry Blackwell and Lucy Stone.
Uh-huh.
And that Henry Blackwell, they made an agreement where he offered to be her secretary, right, instead of her husband. And then they had an agreement where they each have separate, they keep their income separate. Did she pay him for being a secretary?
I don't know. I don't know. I would assume so. I don't know.
I don't know either. I wondered about that.
I mean,
Also-
I mean, I would assume if he was her personal assistant, if she was, he would have a salary, but he also fundraised for her.
as part of
So,
his secretarial duty.
right.
They probably worked together and shared the money.
Yeah, I'm sure that they had a lot of shared business interests. I'm sure it wasn't constantly separated.
So I had another question, which was at the same time as Seneca Falls, there was, I think it was called the Liberty Party. And the person who was the presidential nominee was somehow related.
Or you can put it on or off, doesn't matter.
Was
I'm sorry.
somehow related to the Stantons or somebody that was involved in Seneca Falls. And that party, I'm trying to remember if his name was like Willis or something, and that party nominated as a candidate a woman for vice president. And that was the first time that had ever happened from any party. Do you know anything about that?
I've never heard of that.
Okay.
No.
I'm trying to remember the presidential nominee's connection to one of the women who was at Seneca Falls, who started that conference, but I can't remember it.
No.
I've got a question about the 3 women that were physicians in Cincinnati.
Yes.
Did they have a big following, and was there a lot of support for women's reproductive rights at that time in Cincinnati?
I don't have my information about them mostly comes from suffrage sources. So, I mean, Sarah Sewers, she's definitely considered I mean, I found her in other national sources, as far as her, wanting to, she really fought for equal rights for women doctors and for equal respect and for the whole pain relief thing. I'll be honest with you, I know that Elizabeth Campbell, I found documents about, that's how I found out about the Catholic thing. She was a major player at Christ Hospital, and she had a birth control clinic there. I myself have wondered if that's why Planned Parenthood is so close to Christ.
Oh.
Because that was what but I couldn't find anything to tell me that.
I wondered that too, the same thing, yeah.
I couldn't find, but she wasn't asked because they just said, can you take your clinic outside the hospital because we're getting too much trouble. So she was on the board and everything with Christ Hospital. So
When does women's suffrage, when does the movement start talking reproductive rights in terms of abortion?
I don't have an exact date, but I would say when women start becoming doctors, because that's what I mean, Southgate. I mean, those are the things that they're talking about: sex education, birth control, and abortion. And they all became doctors around 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century. So I would say, yeah. I didn't get specifically into abortion. It just said, that's what they were. I mean, I didn't go into research what they actually did around abortion, but they were advocating for those things. They were doctors. Like I said, most of them graduated in the 80s or 90s. Out of those 3, I think they all graduated. So, and that was pretty, because Blackwell became a doctor in 49. So, and I didn't mention this, but by 1880, being a doctor was considered a very respectful and one of the most popular professions for women. But I'm thinking as women became doctors, most of them were funneled into women's health care. And that would just naturally lead to that. I mean, because they would be seeing women dying. If they're delivering babies and watching women dying.
Sure. And I'm sure that women were asking, hey, how do I stop this?
I mean, I have 3 women, and all 3 of them are talking about reproductive rights and birth control. So I imagine it wasn't an uncommon thing. 3 out of 3.
Thank you for that.
So there were, 17 states in the Union that independently created voting rights for women at the time that the 19th Amendment was attempting to happen, right? Something like that?
I have, that sounds right. I know in 1912, when Alice Paul came to the scene, 9 states had voted to give women suffrage. And then I didn't like check numbers past that.
Do you know some of the different reasons for why they did it?
Give suffrage to women?
Yeah, because some of it had nothing to do with the suffragist movement.
Well, yeah, a lot of it was temperance. Ohio, it was temperance because the Cincinnati was one of the largest beer makers in the country, and the German American Beer Alliance didn't want it, and so they lobbied against it. That was a big thing, was temperance. The German Beer Associations lobbied pretty effectively against suffrage.
It was mostly Western states, though, wasn't it?
What? Temperance? Yeah, the ones that
No.
gave, most of the ones that gave suffrage were Western states. A lot of them did that to get women to move there. That was really the thought process because there were no women. So that's how you get them to move out west, so there'll be women to marry.
Uh-huh.
That's what I was getting at, yeah.
Yeah. That's why most of them did it, yeah. I mean, women out west had property rights, and they were, I mean, Wyoming was called the equality state because they had like the first bailiff, I mean, they had like the first bailiff, the first woman governor. I mean, they, really quickly after they became a state. In fact, they actually would not become a state when they applied for statehood. They told them they had to not let women vote, and they said, no women, no statehood. Sorry, we won't come without the women.
That's interesting.
But that's, well, he wanted women to move to Wyoming. He also had a mother that wanted to vote. So those mothers, I mean, the mother of Wyoming and the mother, I love, like, we need to build a statue to Feb Burn. Be a good boy and help Cat with a rat. He said, okay, Mom.
Did you talk about the Silent Sentinels at all?
Those were, that was, I didn't give the name, but that was the guard that they basically picketed the White House every day.
And they chained themselves, they used the
Yeah.
Pankhurst's
Right,
tactics of chaining themselves to the wall, to the fence and stuff. It
right.
was very embarrassing to Woodrow Wilson.
They
Yeah.
annoyed and embarrassed him until he finally was like, okay. Yeah, that's, yeah. Yeah, that was kind of, yeah, they basically would be there every day. They said the men, a lot of like the male allies would heat up bricks for the women to stand on in the winter because it would be so cold, because they would stand in front of the White House all day. I didn't mention Inez Milholland. She actually died while giving a speech.
Wow.
And her last words were, Mr. President, when will you give women, where's the picture? I'm sorry, let me find what.
She wasn't the one who said, you brought us into this war to fight for democracies overseas, and you won't give democracy here to the women.
No, that was what kind of pushed him over the edge. When Russia gave women the vote, that pushed Wilson over the edge, because the press really went crazy. Where's my notes on her? Where's it?
While you're looking, I want to make a suggestion. It was interesting to discover how many suffragists were free thinkers or atheists. And really interesting if you felt like forging ahead, doing a talk about free thought in the women's suffrage movement.
Okay. I mean,
free thinkers, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Bible, rewrote the Bible. Here we go.
So did Jefferson. I was gonna.
Mr. President, how
We're
long?
waiting to put that.
Oh, that's what it was. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Were her final words
Whoa.
before she collapsed. And
What
then
a way to
she
go.
went to a coma and died a few weeks later.
What a way to go.
And that's why the banners say that in front of that's what kind of spurred that. Mr. Wilson, how much longer that was their rally cry when they would protest in front of the White House.
I wish
How long must women wait for liberty?
I wish Ruth Bader Ginsburg's last words would have the same impact.
Well,
Yes.
hey, I want to a newcomer came through is John Nagy. You can see him there, and he is a new FIG member. He joined FIG. He went
Oh.
online, and you are all members, so I don't have to urge anybody to join. But thank you. John was saying, I knew he had been to a lot of meetings, and he asked me, about the meetings, and I said, well, you can come for free. It's public. And he said, well, if I'm going to come, I want to pay.
Well, absolutely.
Yay, John!
Thank you, John. Welcome.
No,
Hello.
Far too interesting, and I get too much out of it to just mooch.
Good for you.
Desiree,
Thank you.
fascinating. Can you make your slides available so they will be on our website?
Sure, I can send you to it.
I
Okay.
think it's also recorded, and all the slides are in the recording, right, Peter?
All the slides are in the
Oh, I
recording.
forgot to move them, yeah.
Yeah, all the
You have to
slides
do
are,
it mine.
yes, almost all the slides are in the recording. You can get the recording from the website, go to the navigation, hit video. It'll take me a day or two to get it up.
Yeah.
And but if you send me the slides, I can hold them and give them to anybody who asks for them.
Yeah.
If you want to do that, I mean, your
Oh,
slide.
yeah, I can do that, yeah.
Okay, sure. So it'll be packed up as a PDF or whatever, and we'll give them to anybody who wants them.
Personally, I'd like to congratulate Desiree on her presentation. It was-
Absolutely. Hear, hear.
and-
Yes, very good.
Very well done.
Yes.
And also Elaine on the job she did as a host.
Trust.
Thank you, Elaine. and
Sure,
Desiree.
my pleasure.
Oh,
Yes,
that, you know what?
If I can give a call out to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we have 2 walking tours if you're interested. The Queen City Suffrage that I do, and we also do one on African American history in Walnut Hills now, and they're only
Okay.
by appointment. So I know if that's something FIG wants to do as a group. I'm sure Christina would love a tour if anybody wants to do those tours.
So would we
Well,
need to have a number of people in order to do that? Do we have a minimum number?
I think it is $12 a person for the tour, but they
Correct.
want what they want is $100. So if you have more than 10, they want $100. If they don't get 10 people, then it's $12 per person.
Okay.
So one of you can do it for $100, right?
Right. I mean, we've actually had people do that.
Wow. Okay.
Well,
If
there was a mom and her kids. She just gave $100.
if there's no more visit, I'm gonna stop
Hello?
recording. Can I stop recording? Are we gonna do any more promotion?
Yes, I have one. I have one.
Yeah, I think you're good.
I
What-
have.
what-
I
I
have.
only wanted to mention that because of the talk tonight, that if you wanted, some people mentioned the Cincinnati history, to go in depth more on Cincinnati, because I didn't do that tonight.
I mean, we can stay on and talk. I'm not shutting us down. I'm just gonna stop
I
recording.
just one comment.
Go ahead.
Yes.
I didn't like Bill's version of a Sole Mio.
On that, I'm stopping recording.